Previously on Gold in the Shadows, The Men Who Got in My Way the Year I Tried Not to Be Gay. Chapter 5, Letters from John and Josh.
I left Colorado, but I didn't leave the brothers behind. Back at seminary, my body was in Kentucky, but my desire was still tangled up in Colorado, caught between John's tenderness and Josh's invitation. John wrote first, with a letter so intimate, so carefully restrained, it only made me want him more. He made me feel chosen, understood, dangerously close to something I'd spent years trying not to name. Then came Josh, more direct, more embodied, more impossible to dismiss. He didn't just stir longing in me. He made me imagine another life. By the time I tried to explain any of this to Will, I already knew the truth. This was no longer simple friendship. I was being pulled by both brothers in different ways, and I wanted more than my theology knew how to bless. And when Josh sent a letter, then pulled it back before I could read it, I knew I was in deeper than I wanted to admit. That was when I went to see Dr. Joy.
This week on Gold in the Shadows, Chapter 6, Mining for Gold.
So what do you think life is trying to tell you about your visit in Colorado? Dr. Joy asked it as if he were asking about a class assignment, not about the fact that I had come back from Colorado longing for one brother, tempted by the other, and already becoming vulnerable to the next man who made me feel seen. I looked down and said nothing, because the answer, if I gave it honestly, would have sounded less like discernment and more like desire. John was still with me in the ache of being known. Josh was still with me in the ache of being wanted. And somewhere in the background, though I did not yet understand his place in the story, Matias had been shimmering at the edge of my attention long before I met John or Josh. At 39, in the year of covenant, these were the men memory kept bringing back to me, not as interruptions, but as clues. I had hoped that prayer and discipline would quiet my past and settle my future. Instead, the men returned with more force, as if life itself were trying to tell me something I had spent years refusing to hear. Back then, though, sitting across from Dr. Joy, I couldn't say it like that. What I said instead to his question about what life was trying to tell me was, I don't know. That's the problem. He leaned back in his chair, calm as ever. Then start with what you do know. I almost smiled. What I knew was a mess. So I gave him the cleanest true thing I had. I feel divided. At 39, that was still one of the truest words I had for myself. Divided. Not only between celibacy and desire, not only between faith and sexuality, but between the self I had spent years trying to offer God and the self that kept rising up anyway. Through memory, through ache, through the men I could not forget. That year, as I tried one last time to bring my life into alignment through prayer, abstinence, and discipline, the past did not grow quieter. It grew louder. Josh returned. John returned. And eventually, Matias too. Not as random recollections, but as if memory itself were insisting on a different reading of my life than the one I had spent years defending. I had entered my year-long covenant to not be gay, hoping for resolution. What I got instead was excavation. The men did not disappear. They gathered. John, with his tenderness and the way he had made me feel known too quickly. Josh, with his directness and the dangerous possibility he seemed to embody. Matias, ever present then, but already carrying that charged familiarity I would only later know how to name. At the beginning of the covenant year, I might still have called these men distractions, temptations, unfinished attachments, old vulnerabilities rising under stress. But as the months went on, something in me began to suspect that they were more than interruptions. They were clues, signposts, gold beginning to glint in places I had only ever called shadow. I did not have that language yet when I first went to Dr. Joy's office after returning from Colorado. Or rather, I had begun hearing language like that around seminary, in classes, in books, in fragments, but it still sounded more like theory than something I could trust. I was too loyal to the faith structure that had held me together, too convinced that holiness required restraint, too suspicious of my own desires to believe that anything good could be found in the very places I most wanted God to remove. Dr. Joy would become one of the first people to challenge that instinct in me, the instinct to treat my longings for men as nothing more than shameful evidence against myself. He was not encouraging me to be gay, nor was he giving me permission to pursue the men I desired. His hope, as I understood it then, was that if I could look beneath the longing, the wounds, the unmet needs, the hunger for connection and belonging, I might find a way to address them without acting on them. But even within those limits, his approach felt different, more gracious, less condemning. He did not ask me to hate the longing. He asked me to listen to it. He was one of those rare men who made room for complexity without collapsing into confusion. A professor of human development, widely respected, quietly controversial in a conservative seminary, because he spoke about sexuality with more realism and warmth than many of the others dared to. He stayed within Orthodox Christian faith, at least as the institution understood those boundaries, but within them, he created space for honesty that many of us had never known. Men like me found him, or maybe he found us. He drew in those of us who were struggling to reconcile faith with longing, chastity with male tenderness, devotion with questions we were not yet prepared to phrase too clearly. He was a kind of magnet for men questioning their sexual orientation or trying to survive it with dignity. He embraced us, listened to us, gave us a place to confess and hope for change, but without pressuring us to become simpler than we were. He also had a phrase he liked to use: "Let's mine for the gold in the dark places of your life." The first time I heard him say that, I didn't like it. Actually, I despised it. Darkness still felt too raw in me to be discussed like a site visit for treasure. I remember bristling a little, as if he were moving too fast, too quickly from pain to meaning, too quickly from shadow to promise. At that point, I was still mostly interested in grieving what had been legitimately lost to the dark, not learning from it. Gold, I remember thinking. How about we admit it's dark first? I did not yet understand that he was not trying to skip the darkness. He was trying to teach us how to stay with it long enough for something else to appear. Back then, though, I wasn't there yet. On the surface, and not falsely, I thought celibacy and devotion were God's remedies. I believed sincerely that this was what God asked of me. I wanted to be the kind of man who could surrender desire and call it faithfulness. But beneath that earnest layer was another one, no less real for being less acceptable. I wanted men, their attention, their closeness, their warmth, their choosing. And beneath even that was the question I was increasingly afraid to ask outright: what if this was not merely the shape of my temptation? What if it was the shape of my life? That was the self I carried into Dr. Joy's office, and that was the self he began slowly to teach me not to fear quite so quickly. He asked then about Colorado again, and I gave him a little more, not the full ache of wanting to drop everything and go back, not how much their correspondence had already begun rearranging me, but enough. There were two brothers, I said. One I already knew, the other I met while I was there, and I came back more attached than I know what to do with. He didn't react visibly to the word attached, but I saw him register it. More attached to one than the other? He asked. Yes, I said. And is the attachment the problem? He said. Or what it represents? That was a very Dr. Joy question. It did not let me stay at the surface. I don't know, I said. He leaned back slightly and said, try. What I appreciated about him, even when he irritated me, was that he expected more honesty than most people, but did not weaponize that expectation. I felt safe with one of them, I said. Seen, maybe. Understood too quickly, and with the other, I stopped. With the other? He asked. With the other, it felt more direct. I hesitated. Like possibility. He nodded once and said, and now you're back here. Yes, I responded. And your body is still there? He asked. That startled me. Not because it was crude. It wasn't, but because it was accurate. I looked at him for a second and said, yeah. He was quiet for a moment, then said, one of the great mistakes religious people make is assuming that because something is confusing, it must be unholy. Sometimes confusion is just what it feels like when the shadow starts speaking. That was one of the first times I remember him using language like that with me. The shadow? I asked. He smiled slightly. The part of you that has been forced underground. The part you've learned to fear or hide or disown because it doesn't fit your approved self-image. I'd heard some of that language in class, and by then I was brushing up against it in readings that would later connect more clearly for me through Parker Palmer and Jung. But back then, it still felt half foreign, half dangerous. So, I said, I'm supposed to trust the shadow? No, he said. You're supposed to listen to it. That answer stayed with me. He continued, the shadow isn't always noble. It holds pain, fear, compulsion, immaturity, self-deception. But it also holds vitality, lost desire, buried truth, pieces of yourself you had to exile in order to belong. If you only moralize it, you'll miss what it's trying to tell you. I remember not liking that either, at least not fully, because I could feel where such a line of thought might lead, and I was not ready to go there. So where does holiness fit in? I asked. Where does obedience fit? Not everything buried is meant to be lived out. No, he said. Of course not. He paused. But neither is everything buried meant to stay buried. That sentence landed in me with more force than I showed him, because at that point I was still living as though my task was mainly containment, manage desire, redirect it, spiritualize it, keep the lid on, use the right language, stay within the boundaries. But Dr. Joy was suggesting that even if discipline mattered, discernment mattered too, that the dark was not only where sin and shame hid, it was also where truth had been exiled. I don't know what to do with that, I told him. You don't have to know yet, he said. Just don't settle for the cheapest interpretation of your pain. That was another one of his ways. He spoke in sentences that sounded like they should have annoyed me more than they did. He asked then about the brothers again, and I gave him a little more. Not every detail. Not the full ache of wanting to drop everything and go back. Not how much their correspondence had already begun rearranging me, but enough for him to see that this was not a passing crush, and not only an erotic fixation either. What do you think you wanted from them? He asked. I answered too quickly. Affection. He nodded, as if to say, keep going. To feel close, I said. To feel chosen, maybe. He looked at me carefully. That's usually where the gold is. I almost rolled my eyes. No, I said. That's where the problem is. He smiled, but not condescendingly. Maybe, but the problem is rarely the whole story. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he was asking of me. I had spent so many years trying to correct my desires, confess them, resist them, explain them, spiritualize them, and survive them, that the idea of becoming curious about them felt almost dangerous. Curiosity sounded too close to permission, and permission was exactly what I was afraid of. But Dr. Joy was not asking me to pursue the men I desired. He was not giving me a new theology or secret doorway out of the conflict that had shaped so much of my life. His hope, as I understood it then, was still that if I could look beneath the longing to the wounds, unmet needs, buried grief, and hunger for connection that might be driving it, then perhaps those deeper places could be healed and the desire itself resisted or redirected. It was still a framework of correction, but it was a more gracious one than I had known before. He did not condemn me for having the longing. He invited me to listen to it. What need was speaking there? What wound? What buried part of myself was trying to come into the light? The shadow was still a new language to me then. I had heard the word in classes and books, in fragments of conversations around seminary, but it still sounded half theoretical, half threatening, like a place I might enter and never find my way back from. I was willing, perhaps, to admit that I had a shadow. I was less prepared to believe that anything good could be hidden there. At 39, during my year of covenant, I would return to that conversation often. I had entered that year hoping God would help me settle the question once and for all. I wanted celibacy to feel unquestionably right. I wanted my years of sacrifice to hold meaning. I wanted God's will to align neatly with the self I could safely present. But Colorado had unsettled all of that. John and Josh had not faded. Their letters, their faces, their nearness, their absence, all of it had followed me back to seminary. And now Dr. Joy was suggesting that the ache itself might have something to say. Not everything in the dark was meant to be obeyed, but maybe not everything in the dark was meant to be destroyed either. That was the thought I sat with in his office as the hour began to turn toward the lunch group he hosted for men like me, men trying to survive the space between faith and longing, men searching the body and the soul for signs, men hoping someone could finally tell us which parts of ourselves were holy and which parts needed to be healed. I did not know then that the next conversation would make the question even harder. I did not know that another man's story would force me to wonder whether the body could speak with the voice of truth. And I did not know that the ache I had carried back from Colorado was about to meet something much closer than memory. John and Josh were far away, but another man was already on campus, already part of my life, already close enough to unsettle what distance had allowed me to romanticize. His name was Matias, and when he entered the room, he would not feel like an answer. He would feel like the question becoming flesh.
Next time on Gold in the Shadows, The Men Who Got in My Way, the year I tried not to be gay. Chapter 7, Matias and the Company of Men. The conversation with Dr. Joy is interrupted by a knock at the door. Matias enters, and suddenly, everything Dr. Joy has been saying about desire, shadow, and buried truth is no longer theoretical.
Matias is right there in front of me. In Dr. Joy's lunch group, a circle of men gathers. Men trying to survive the divide between faith and longing, body and belief, holiness and hunger. Then one man tells a story, a sexual encounter, a physical reaction, a body that seems to say no. And as I listen, another question begins to rise in me. If one man's body can speak through revulsion, what does my body say through longing?
Chapter 7, Matias and the Company of Men. Because sometimes the question does not arrive as an idea. Sometimes it walks into the room. Gold in the Shadows is a production of the Good Life Lab with Dr. Dave.